Hi everyone, so thank you for coming. As I said a moment ago, my name is Paul Nowak, and the name of my talk is Gaymers, the Difference a Y Makes. First, who am I and why should you even bother listening to me? I'm a game designer. I've worked making games for a number of large companies. I'm also a social scientist, going back to my master's work in studying the relationship between sexual identity and video game playing preferences. I'm also myself a gay gamer, and if I may say so, a heck of a nice guy. So it's been a great deal of focus in our industry of trying to study where the gaming market comes from. And traditionally the focus has been on the young, heterosexual, cisgender male as being viewed as the primary purchaser of video game products. Unfortunately for us as a diverse community, the more we understand the different segments playing video games as game makers, the more we can reach out to those specific demographics and the higher revenue that we can see from more people wanting to purchase our products. A great deal of time and energy has been invested into studying different groups such as girl gamers, parents who are gamers, older gamers, gamers who want to play together in person and online. Unfortunately, there hasn't really been a focus specifically on gay gamers as a community, as a specific demographic to be courted by the game making industry. And when I was looking into that, I wondered, why is that? Firstly, why should anybody care about, why should any game maker care about us as a group? And a particular example that I found absolutely fascinating was the fact that as recently as 1998, the Democratic National Convention's message to the gay community was that you're welcome to come, just sit in the back and keep your mouth shut. This was the message from the Dukakis' campaign to gay constituents who had donated over $1 million to the election campaign. And in 1992, when George Bush I was running, he chose to position himself as the protector of family values in a heated time when being gay was becoming more accepted and the backlash conflict was becoming more heated. And while, in response to that, while all 5 Democratic candidates at the time promised a repeal of the ban on gay serving in the military and an increase to spending on AIDS research, only Bill Clinton set himself apart by saying, we do not have any person in this society to waste, that he had a vision and that gay people were a part of it. Essentially, this made Bill Clinton the unofficial gay-sponsored candidate. And with the margins on that particular election being so close, the gay community raised over $3 million and essentially put Clinton in the White House. So that's why we care. We are a focused group when we are being directly courted. We can affect positive change in our world when we act together. So there's some language that we're going to need to establish first to get it out of the way. When we are talking about the gamer generation, we are talking about those people who turned 40 or younger in the year 2010. What makes this a specific generation is that it was the first generation for whom playing games was a defining part of growing up. Games were no longer a novelty, they were no longer a fad, they became a fundamental part of growing up not only in America, but around the world. It encompasses the gamer generation encompasses other labels such as Gen X, Gen Y, Millennials, and it's most notably known as the Nintendo generation because the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the original Famicom system, around the world was the first time that any one console saw a 90% share of the market. So most people in this generation can have some association back to Nintendo. Some additional language, when we talk about gamers without a Y, we're talking about people who spend a fundamental portion of their time growing up playing video games. It no longer becomes important whether they continue to do so later in life, but the fact that they spent an inordinate amount of time playing games as youths helps to shape the way that they see the world. As some notes for anyone who isn't as familiar with game design, LeBlanc's taxonomy of game pleasures includes some of the things that we want to look at when we want to assess different demographic segments. Specifically of interest to our conversation of gay gamers are elements of fantasy, narrative, discovery, and self-expression. Some of you may be more interested with this theory of Bartle's taxonomy of player types. Essentially, Bartle divided all game players into 4 groups represented by the suits on a card: killers, socializers, achievers, and explorers. Killers want to dominate other figures, whether they are NPCs or other players. Socializers are there just for the experience of being part of the world. Achievers want to climb the highest mountains, unlock every achievement, get all the gamer points they can, see all the sites. And explorers want to see all the sites and see what the world has to offer as part of an entertainment system. But central to our conversation of any understanding of demographics within the game-playing public is the idea of meaningful play. Meaningful play is when the relationship between a player's activities and the outcome of those activities are both integral to what's happening and discernible. Essentially, if you swing a sword, something gets hurt. So is an example of meaningful play. Meaningful play becomes highly personal, just as personal as one's taste in movies or music. And it's those similarities by what we find meaningful in our game playing preferences that allows us to be grouped together. So for example, what is meaningful for older game players may not be the same as what's meaningful among female game players, but by individuals within those groups will have largely the same similarities. The exact opposite is also true. So while it's important to be able for the player to see themselves within the game and within the narrative, it is also the fact that gaming provides a safe space for us to take actions that we would not normally take in the real world. This is part of what makes games like Grand Theft Auto so appealing. It provides a safe space for us to explore taboos, to break the law, to indulge in those little guilty pleasures without having to deal with the consequences. And it's also noted that meaningful play is what gives the majority of MMOs their popularity. Not only can we control, for the most part, our avatar and seeing ourselves as the ideal versions of ourselves. We can be, taller, we can be blonder, we can be more fit, we could be more buff, but we can control in an MMO setting the way that other people see us by choosing those things about our avatar. So who are gay gamers? When I say gay gamers, I specifically include all those individuals who, in addition to being gamers and having spent all of their time growing up playing video games, as those who identify themselves as having a sexual orientation other than exclusively heterosexual. I understand, as many of other people do, that sexual orientation is a broad spectrum. So to be as inclusive as possible, this was my definition. It also includes anyone who is perhaps transgender, who is questioning, to be as inclusive as possible. When I talk about homosexual content, what I am discussing is content that the player can either observe or participate in which reflects a homosexual orientation in either positive or equal to heterosexual orientation. It's not specifically evangelical, it's just a note about acceptance within the game world. It is always age appropriate. While I absolutely think that there is perhaps room in the marketplace for a video game based on children's books like Daddy's Roommate or King and King, this is not the kind of game based on those materials where I would expect to see an older theme. In most countries, video games are subjected to a ratings review board. If any of this content was designed to be hidden only for older players, the review board should still be notified of its inclusion before they give a rating, so that ratings can remain accurate. I don't I don't purport to have people hiding this content in the video games. And we'll get into more of that later. Additionally, I also talk about content that hinges on the intent of those players and characters within the game. What is not included in our conversation of homosexual content? Disguising a heterosexual character in cross-gendered dress in order to, for example, escape from a prison or to get into an area which is usually reserved for the character's opposite gender. It also doesn't include any activities which one may need to partake in order to maintain that deception. So if anybody happens to remember the massage scene from Final Fantasy X-2, that is not included in what I'm talking about in homosexual content. Again, the characters were trying to escape from a prison and were forced into a situation that they would not otherwise have taken part in willingly. Obviously, I think it's fairly acceptable to say that we're not talking about homosexual rape of a heterosexual character. We are not also talking about the same-sex prostitution of desperate but otherwise heterosexual characters, such as drug addicts or heterosexual characters who are being financially manipulated. And we are not including hate speech in this conversation of heterosexual content, homosexual content. Are you with me so far? Okay, I'm sorry. A lot to cover. It's also helpful to have an understanding of social psychology for what we're about to get into for games. Social psychology deals with one's opinion and identifications of themselves. So answers to the question, who am I? You know, I'm a student, I'm a mother, I'm a doctor, I'm a gamer. These are all parts of how we see ourselves. In addition to that, are questions of who are we as a people. You know, we are families, we are church communities, we are students at school, we are members of ethnic backgrounds. And these together are unique for each individual. It's often the case that if one is a member of a majority, that they will only become aware of their social identity once they are suddenly finding themselves to be staying in that same group, but where that group has now shrunk. So if you're in an unfamiliar neighborhood, you now no longer are ignorant of the fact that you feel that you belong in a different place, that you are no longer with your neighbors. This is actually the cornerstone, without realizing it, of most video games. You know, this begins to be seen when we're talking about players versus non-player characters, when we're talking about heroes versus villains, when we're talking about who is on our team versus who is not. It's also one of the basic cornerstones of human survival over the course of evolution. You know, we are cavemen, we are not saber-toothed tigers. Saber-toothed tigers are trying to kill us. So it's important to understand that this is constantly going on in the background. And as I said before, being a person of the LGBT community often includes a fundamental reconciling of being different at a very young age. The process of coming out has often been so emotionally impactful on us in a developmental stage that it has become a defining characteristic of our self-identity, which is usually just as important to ourselves as our ethnic background or our faith. So this is a major part of who we are as a people. That's why we're at this convention, frankly, to recognize and celebrate those differences that bring us together. So when I was looking into why there was no profile of the gay gaming public, I was like, don't people understand that we bring this part of our sexual identity with us to everything that we do, including playing games? This is insane. So I went and I did my own study. I looked into the existing research and I found that the gay gaming population in America alone represents over $750 billion worth of buying power. And our primary interest is in playing games. It seemed absolutely absurd to me. So again, taking the Nintendo generation as a starting point of being 168 million people, and taking out of that 92% who have regular access to and enjoyment of playing video games, combined it with the 10%, according to the Kinsey study and the Janus and Janus research teams, of those incidents of being non-exclusively heterosexual within the American population, which is part of why the construct was described that way. Personally, I think that if unfortunately, I think that if that study would be done today, we'd see a lot higher self-reporting incidents, just because times have changed. It's been more acceptable. People aren't as likely to suffer ill events at work or at home, or possibly being beaten for admitting this to a researcher. So a conservative estimate, $750 billion worth of buying power. Personally, I think it's higher. So I did my own study of over 7,000 international participants, with the help of a research review board to preserve the accuracy of the findings. It was majoritively made up of gay males, and the findings were actually really impressive, to me anyway. So that's the majority of what I'm here to share with you. Okay, now that I got the introduction out of the way. So for gay gaming males and females, the primary genre of preference was role-playing games. This was not particularly surprising to me based on my personal experience, but what was surprising was the reason listed for that, and it was the depth of story points, and the ability that we could see ourselves being accepted into worlds which include many different fantasy backgrounds, elves and dwarves and magic users, and not that there seemed to be a place for everybody, that we more often could find a place for ourselves within those worlds. It surprised me also to find that over 10% of gay gaming males were reporting that first-person shooter was their genre of choice. I didn't think it would be this high, frankly. I don't think I've ever met any gay gamers who had enjoyed first-person shooters as their genre of choice. And if anybody has, can I see a show of hands? Please feel free to talk to me after the show, because you guys will be the first. But what I wasn't surprised about were things like sports games are not of particular interest to our community, at least not in any significant numbers according to this sample of our community. When compared with the heterosexual respondents to the same survey, I was absolutely stunned that only 7% listed first-person shooters as their genre of choice. This is actually less than the homosexual gamers of the same survey, who reported 11%. I know, because we always perceive that it's straight males who are playing first-person shooters. And it just turned out not to be true. What I did find more interesting was that there was a higher amount of interest among different genres. So while gays, as both male and female, tend to focus almost exclusively on role-playing games, heterosexuals are more interested in puzzle games, in action-adventure games, in rhythm games, in casual games to play together. It seemed that we preferred to stay away from most online communities in which we couldn't control the appearance of our avatar, and that we would much rather play alone, probably because we've dealt with, for so long, a less than welcoming reception in the online playing community. What was also pretty fascinating to me was that gay males and straight women seem to have a much more in-tune set of preferences than gay males and straight males. And the same was also true for straight males and gay women, or lesbians, in that their choice of genre was lining up, as was their self-reported play styles. So we can see that the majority of gay gaming males profess themselves to be explorer types. They want to see what is available within the fictional world that they're taking part in. And while this was also true with lesbians, lesbians and their straight counterparts had reported killer types within the same measure. But if we swip back and forth, you can see that killer types are far more prevalent among heterosexual males than it is among gay males. Again, the self-reporting amount of explorer is nearly identical for heterosexual males as it is for lesbians. So maybe it started to occur to me that we're just very much the same, but just looking at things from different perspectives. So the majority of my research allows me to feel comfortable saying that my gaming profile, my profile of the gay gaming community is that we are an explorer and achiever-based group of people who mostly prefer RPGs. We are an experienced and invested group of players playing 3 to 4 hours a day with histories of primary game playing preferences over the past 11 years or more. If you put this together, this accounts to like over 150,000 hours of gameplay per person. 3 to 4 hours a day over the course of 11 years. Again, why more game makers are not courting this demographic boggles the mind. We as a group are not as concerned with realistic graphics as our heterosexual counterparts are, but we are more interested in things like novelty, in storyline, in consuming new content, in finding new ways to play, not just by ourselves, but with others in real space. So we would much rather have people come over and play with us than we would be to play over the internet. When asked if the inclusion of all other things being equal, if you found out that a game would include homosexual content in the terms I described earlier, would you be more willing to purchase a game both inside your preferred genre and outside your preferred genre? While I see a number of people in this room shaking their heads, it surprised me, nodding their heads, it surprised me that only 70% of the respondents to the survey said that they would be more motivated to make a different purchase. The other 30%, it didn't seem logical to me. So I wanted to ask why. And the response that I got back most often was that they were afraid of what kind of content we would get if we asked for it. Many people remembered the kinds of games that were made for young girls in the 90s after the success of Barbie Fashion Designer, which produced such fantastic hits as Mary-Kate and Ashley's Horse Racing. So I was curious, not that that's a bad game, I've played it, it's fantastic, okay? I'm just gonna be honest, it was a fun game, but perhaps I'm in the minority on that opinion. So I was stunned by this. I was like, why would we be afraid of that? So I took a look at some of the more notable titles to include homosexual content in video games up to this point. And here's what I found. So the first and most often touted that I found at the time was Mass Effect. When I played through Mass Effect, so nobody told me what the content was. I decided to go out and experience it for myself. My first playthrough, I completely missed what was considered by many to be homosexual content because I chose to play the hero as a male. The romantic options within the game include one with Liara, who is a member of a genderless species. But as we can see from the character model, her entire species has characteristics that are pretty clearly taken from human female anatomy. The fact that choosing a male Commander Shepard doesn't produce a Liara with more traditionally human male characteristics makes this not really a great example of homosexual content under the terms that we're discussing. You can miss it. It is not at all gender balanced, and it doesn't take into consideration any of the choices that the player has made up to that point regarding how they see themselves. Similarly, in the Fable franchise, the entire marketing point for Fable was that you could finally, after years of gaming, create the hero that you always wanted to make. So even though in the first installment you could only play as a male character, as a male hero, whose name is Hero, that's not a misspelling. For our community, this meant we could finally have a gay protagonist. So that's what many of us went and did, and including myself. And I found out that around mid-development, the game makers realized that they had made everybody they'd made everybody attracted to Hero by default. So they accidentally created a bisexual world. So whereas every NPC had a rating of how attracted they were to Hero based on the player's customizable choices, they accidentally created some gay content in there. And then we're like, oh crap, this is not what we wanted to do. Let's spend extra money and resources to remove this from our game. Money and resources that could have been much better spent adding content to this game. This really shows in the fact that even though you can get married to your choice of female villagers with very distinct character models from one another, there's really only one, perhaps two character models for males who would fall in love with you. So your choices are one of a harem of 40 women in every village of different character designs, or one guy. This does not say anything for the fact that we as a people are not all attracted to the same one character model. In the same way that our well-intentioned straight friends always try to match us up with the one gay friend that they have. A few more interesting things to point out in the Fable franchise was that it actually penalizes any player who chose to preserve their vision of Hero as a gay character. There are spaces within the game that you can't access unless you, for example, marry Mayoress Lady Grey to receive her treasures in her mayor's mansion, or unlock the treasure that you would get, for example, sleeping with one of the women in the brothel. Had there been, which is, by the way, particularly painful to those of us who are explorers and achiever types. Additionally, so you're either forced to not find out what these mystery treasures are, or you're forced to compromise your vision of what Hero is and who you are in their universe. Additionally, because this was not thought out from the beginning, this title shipped with every time you went home. You would be asked if you wanted to sleep with your wife, and if it was the one guy in town, it would still say sleep with your wife. This is very off-putting. If anybody hasn't experienced it themselves, I mean, screenshot right there. That little circle icon denotes that this is the person to whom you are married. It's a little dark. But that's a point that I really shouldn't be belaboring. But still, I mean, this kind of content was so revolutionary at the time that for all its flaws, it was still embraced by our community. And the iterations in the franchise only got better as a result. And it continued to be more and more embraced by our community to the point where I think they might, for all of its other flaws, I think Fable 3 might be the most highly embraced in the franchise because they kept improving on these problematic issues. I don't know if anybody's ever played the game Enchanted Arms, but this is one of the few games that I was able to find when I was conducting my research of a character or main character within a set scripted video game so that his orientation didn't rely on our choices. Unfortunately, it was about as offensive as the characters on Will and Grace were, looking back at it from 2015. We could see there the character's exposed midriff, his music-based attacks, and his orientation are all kind of culminating in his continued lust for a heterosexual character who does not return his advances, and he doesn't take no for an answer. He becomes, over the course of the gameplay, just kind of the butt of uncomfortable jokes and a grinning sense of, oh, well, you know, we all kind of have these gay friends, and this has come across as offensive as to the members of the survey, because we're not here to be tolerated, we're here to be accepted and embraced, and this is not an accurate depiction of any gay person I've ever met. And I live in West Hollywood. But one of the better examples that I found at the time was Bully. For anybody who hasn't played it, Bully is a game about our heterosexual male, or assumedly heterosexual male character being sent off to boarding school, and the trials and tribulations that he has trying to fit in as a loner among 5 distinct social groups at the boarding school. There's a mechanic introduced partway through the game where if one continues to flirt with and give presence to female characters, that eventually they will think highly of him enough to grant him a kiss, which earns him a health bonus. What made the homosexual content in this game so compelling was that not only was there a male character to kiss for an equal health bonus, there was one from each of the 5 social groups. And they're depicted here. There was one from the preppies, there was a gay bully, there's a gay jock, and there's a gay nerd. This is perhaps one of the most inclusive examples. It could only really have gotten better if there was also an option to play a female protagonist, which would have resulted in the same numbers going the other way. So, for any game makers in the audience who had wanted to introduce some homosexual content into their games, I've developed some guidelines that might make it a little bit more of an easy sell. The first would be to keep it relevant to either the plot or the play mechanics. Being a highly narrative-driven group of people, tacking on gay content as something inconsequential to the world isn't going to be looked upon as favorably as a homosexual romance that is the driving force of the game's play. Additionally, a fantastic example of making it relevant was the fact, as I just mentioned in Bully, of getting an equal health benefit from kissing either a male or female of your choice. Orange would be to make it optional and easy to find. I have absolutely no problem with the fact that game makers would be very adverse to alienating players who don't wish to see this content. And so in order to combat that, ask ourselves if we're going to include this in a more mainstream title, is this something that the player is going to be informed about so that they can make the best choice for themselves as to whether or not they want to experience this content? And if they don't, do they have a way to avoid it? If it's integral to the plot in a way that perhaps involves our antagonist and billions of dollars worth of pre-rendered cutscenes, perhaps this is something that we can put on the back of the box so that, again, consumers can make the choice that is right for them. Again, this should be something that is also included to the submission for your local ratings board. So it could be put in with due consideration as, mild violence or cartoon humor. Yellow would be for remembering your stereotyped preconceived notions. Ask yourself, does the content, does the character you're representing and including in your video game include the concept of any gay person that you actually know? Or are you taking this from other media and continuing to perpetuate a stereotype that you've seen in the past? Green would be to include genders for both genders. If you're allowed to play, I've said this before, if you're allowed to play as either a male or a female or anything in between, that your choice at that point should be reflected in the content that you are experiencing in choice of sexual partners or romance options. If you are playing if you're a member of a genderless species, your romance options should probably also include genderless species. But I think I've belabored that point enough. Keep it balanced with the heterosexual options that you are providing in the game. Failure to do this will result in homosexual content that comes across as thrown together at the last minute, as not being part of the greater world, and as being far less favorable for any member of our community to be thought of as an afterthought. You can also kind of avoid things like Fable, which would punish gamers from maintaining their LGBT character's identity, such as I mentioned, the mayoress of Fable. Lastly, Purple plan on including this from the start, because like with other content, the easier you map out the roadmap ahead of time, the more you can make adjustments when production issues eventually come up and you have to decide what to cut. Allowing the plan from the beginning and working backwards, purple through red, as things need to be cut in your game, allows us to prevent the gay gaming public from feeling like second-class citizens, which is mostly what you're trying to avoid. Over the last few years, I've taken these guidelines that I've come up with, and I've actually, gone out and made some games. The first one that I wanted to talk about was Gossip Girl social climbing for Facebook. For anybody who is not particularly familiar with this intellectual property by Warner Brothers, it was a TV show centered on the scandalous lives of Manhattan's elite, and mostly the problems that their teenagers were having, dealing with sexual identity, drugs, having too much money and freedom at too young an age. So when we were making a video game based on it, it absolutely seemed like the right fit for the intellectual property to include homosexual content. So we planned on having it from the beginning. One of the very first things that Gossip Girl herself asks the player when they join the game is about their gender and their gender preferences, who they find attractive. We were able to come up with a script that was run through the game, which retains the player's choices and would only provide gendered pronouns and descriptions based on their answers. So if one was interested in males, or indicated that they were interested in men, the game would remember that, oh, the hottie that walked into the bar, he has cool sunglasses and is wearing, a kick-ass pair of, Levi's for men, or based on other answers, she's wearing a really hot skirt. It cost us virtually nothing to do this, except to remember to put in some additional text occasionally. And because we took that effort to do so, we saw an absolutely higher number of self-reported gay users, or at the very least, users who wish to experience homosexual content, because that's what they asked for. This did not at all surprise us, because that was part of the demographic of the show. It was highly popular amongst the LGBT male community. Additionally, when I worked for Disney on their title Pixie Hollow, a number of the players were sparrowmen, because there are no boy fairies in Pixie Hollow. They are referred to as sparrowmen. So we wanted to make sure that when we were including content that was, while primarily aimed at the female demographic within the game, for example, here our unicorn costume, that there was also an option included for the male characters so that they could participate in the same kind of content within the same spectrum. So here we could see a fantastic example of the unicorn t-shirt for the Sparrowmen, which, by the way, worked really well as everyday wear. Yeah, that's my character. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Okay. Okay, I'm being given the signal that I need to wrap this up. So the last case study that I wanted to point out was when I was working for the US Olympic team on a social and mobile game. It was to tie in with the Russian Winter Olympics, and this was at the point when Russia had outlawed all mention of homosexuality and whether or not this would be affecting the US Olympic team. And so they chose, since this game was about collecting and trading virtual Olympic pins, they chose that the only way that they wanted to address this within their game was to have the rainbow Team USA pin, as seen there in the bottom right. On the virtual back of the pin, it didn't make any mention of LGBT-specific athletes. It said simply, Team USA has been and always will be proud of all of her athletes. So again, it was relevant in that within the game's economy, it was a high value pin. I did that on purpose. So it was relevant to the gameplay. It was our most popular hard currency purchase pin. So it did drive a great deal of revenue for the US Olympic team in the form of donations. And there's a number of things that we didn't really get into today. For anybody who's interested, more of this can be found on Amazon, or feel free to email me for a promotional copy. I'll send that out as soon as I figure out how to do that. It might take it might take a couple weeks for me to figure that out. But additionally, I will probably be relaunching a new survey in 2016 to see how the perception of our community has changed with greater access to homosexual content due to the iPhone and the invention of apps like Grindr, Scruff, etc. So that's me. I hope you've had some entertaining thoughts, and I'm happy to open the floor to questions. Yes?
Sharing any data that was on your slides, is that cool with you, or should we just direct people who are interested to your website?
No, that's all new, and the data that I couldn't get to is in my book on Amazon. And again, just email me and I'll send you a copy. But no, that's all absolutely quotable data.
It was cool to see the differences between LGBT gamers and straight gamers of I think it was 7,000 people that were seeing.
Yes.
What percentage of the 7,000 people were identifying as LGBT?
It was a majority. It was somewhere, I want to say, around 60 to 65% off the top of my head. But yeah, it was in one of the slides. Oh, additionally, if anybody wants the presentation, email me, I'll send it to you. Yes?
I think it's really awesome how you stated the fact that we bring a lot of our experience and our gay identity to everything we do, whether we inform other people of our sexuality or not. It still is an integral part of who we are and how we deal with the world, and I think it's really good that you mentioned that.
Oh. Thanks. Yeah, it was kind of the cornerstone of what my argument is. Even though it is becoming more and more easy to come out in the modern day, the internal struggle with whether or not to do so is part of what defines us as a community. We have this shared struggled experience to go through. Yes.
So first of all, great, it's amazing.
Thank you.
That's like a whole lot of notes.
Thanks. Would you believe I didn't finish the slides until like yesterday morning? They told me 3 months ago I was doing this. Yesterday morning.
Just pure So my question was, I noticed that throughout this presentation we talked a lot about what sort of homosexual content we want to see in games. But I know that one of the things we were talking about for a second was how LGBT gamers tend to stay away from online spaces, and also in general, there's this sort of, you were saying, this sort of fear of associating in those spaces where there will be a lot more homosexual gamers. So I'm wondering, and maybe this is in your book, but can you talk a little bit more about what sort of changes need to be happening in the gaming community?
That was a little bit outside of my personal background. Being a game designer, I approached the topic from that point of view. My survey does go into a little bit on figures of how much of that anti-gay rhetoric is still out there in MMOs, questioning on how much we still encounter derogatory hate speech, perhaps not aimed at us, but aimed at other players, as if to say being one of us was somehow second class. I don't remember that numbers off the top of my head. I just couldn't fit it into 45 minutes. But no, it is actually still something that we face. And while I don't have any answers to combat that at the moment, it is definitely a challenge that I would love to take on in the future. And I'm going to make note of it and include continued conversations of that in my future research. Yes?
So your survey went after Jason Lockwood's survey in 2006. So did you get to corroborate his findings of the inverted bell curve?
Yes, actually, I did. Jason and I spoke at length before I launched my research, and I actually did get the same amount of the inverted bell curve for participants. For anyone who isn't familiar, Jason and I, Jason was the first researcher in the field of gay gamers. He concerned himself primarily with proving the fact that we exist as a people, as a subgroup. Since he got a lot of that heavy lifting out of the way for me, I could try to figure out what we want from our games from my own perspective as a game designer. The inverted bell curve refers to the fact that both Jason and I got a high amount of heterosexuals, exclusively heterosexuals, and a high amount of exclusively homosexual on the Kinsey scale, with diminishing numbers in the middle. That is mostly, to translate it into English, we had fewer instances of people who reported themselves to be strictly bisexual equally. Yes, in the back?
Is your next study going to include statistics on bisexual gaming preferences?
Yes, I would absolutely love. It all depends on the reportings from from the survey. So unless bisexuals, unless gay men, unless lesbians, unless straight women all turn out to be heard, we can't hear them and help get them the content that they want. So I would absolutely love to have a higher amount of bisexuals reporting into the survey so I can get their opinions. And I'll see what I can do about that. Can't make a horse drink water even if you lead him to it. Yes.
One more question?
Yes. One more question. Anyone? Last question. Yes.
Okay, so I love all this statistics and seeing how we are and why we are. Why do you think there's so little research in this area? Because you mentioned one, and you pretty much came after him. But why was there so little research being done? Because there's still so much that isn't known.
Personally, I think that, and while I might not have any statistics to back this up, I still think that a number of the decision makers are too afraid of backlash from people who are not our allies. And when we're talking about projects with billion-dollar budgets, it often makes more financially secure sense for large companies to try to play it safe. And it really is only the younger maverick companies with less to lose that are less risk adverse and who are willing to include us in their titles. So that would be just my personal opinion. Although I'd love to, take a creative role at a large company and help change that. But fingers crossed. All right, well, thank you all very much for coming. I was told that was the last question.